Welcome everybody, my name's David Wood. I guess I can say welcome to the future because it is 2020 now, isn't it? And for all my life we've sort of been looking forward to the amazing things that may or may not be possible in 2020. And in some ways we are living in an amazing world, and in some ways it's just the same as before. The London Futurists is changing in 2020 as well. We're going to have a slight different focus in the future. And the focus is, of course, still looking at the future, but particularly looking at how good could the future be if we really understand what's needed and if we took the right action to make it happen. How good could we be in 2050? How good could we, in fact, be by 2035? That's something I've been working on myself for the last few months. There's a book coming out soon on exactly that topic. And the meetings we're going to do most of this year are going to be on related themes. One of the things that will be different about the future almost certainly is we're going to have more automation than before. More robots of various sorts, whether they are driverless cars, the terminals in supermarkets where you check out, other kinds of industrial robots, robots at home, robots in the workplace, and also software robots of all sorts. How good could society be if we see the full opportunities of these robots and other automation, and what do we need to do to make that come about? Now, we're not going to get a better future unless we also think about the possible unintended bad consequences of technology. And of course, many people are, rightly, worried about the disruption that automation will bring, disruption to the workplace, and possibly a disruption to our sense of meaning and to other aspects of human flourishing. And the speaker for today's event has been looking at this topic very seriously for quite a while. His book is on the screen, Automation and Utopia. And well, I'm not going to press his whole talk now. I'll just say that I've been reading his book over the last few days, and it is not just one set of ideas. There's at least 4 books, each worthy of being a volume in its own right, contained in this book. 4 very important themes about the future and how we can prepare for it, how we can conceive of the dangers but also conceive of better opportunities. The speaker has come all the way from Galway in the west of Ireland, where he is a lecturer. I won't say more about him, I'll let him introduce himself, but let's just give a warm round of applause to John Danaher.
Thank you, David, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a cold Saturday afternoon to listen to a dry academic talk. No, hopefully it won't be. That's right. So I should say a little bit about my background and also about what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm actually by training a lawyer, but I work in the philosophy of technology, particularly moral theory in technology. And this book that I wrote, Automation and Utopia, is an exercise in understanding the future of human values, trying to look at different possible futures for humanity and figuring out which of those possible futures is desirable, which should we actually aim for, which ones are genuinely utopian. So I have a very particular style of analysis where I try to articulate both the pro and cons of different possible futures and subject them to rigorous analysis. The reason I wrote this book was partly born out of a frustration around books that look at the future of automation and work, technological unemployment. I think many of those books are good on some of the technical details and articulating what's happening in the here and now, but they're less good when they look to what's going to happen in the future and what a post-work future would look like, if that's even conceivable or possible. So one of the intentions behind my book was to try and really drill down into the details of what a post-work future would be. Is it actually something that's possible? Is it something that is desirable? So the book itself is divided into 4 parts, or has 4 propositions that it defends. It's divided into 2 parts. The first part is called automation, The second part is called Utopia. The first part deals with the impacts of automating technologies on our lives. The second part looks at possible utopian futures. Now, in most talks and conversations that I have about this book, I tend to dwell predominantly on the first part of the book, the automation part. That's where a lot of people that's what a lot of people want to engage with. But what I thought I would do for today's talk is try and focus more on the second half of the book, the utopian part, where I try to articulate a particular vision of what a utopian post-work future would be. Now, I won't completely neglect the first part, so I'll give a quick review of the book and the 4 propositions that I defend. So the first proposition that I defend in the book is that the automation of work is possible and desirable. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it is feasible to eliminate the need for people to engage in paid employment. It's not inevitable. It's not something that's going to happen just as a matter of sort of socio-technical necessity. I think there are forces in our contemporary society that encourage the increased automation of work. I'm not reinventing the wheel here. This is an argument that has been made for a very long time about how capitalist economies favor the replacement of human workers with machines, if it's feasible, if it's possible to do so. But there are also, countervailing forces in society that prevent it. The kinds of taxation policies that we have, the kind of educational policies that we have, the kinds of ways in which we invest in innovation. But saying that automation of work is possible is only one part of the equation. I also say that it is desirable. And so many people, when they think about future employment and the possibility of a post-work future, they have a negative orientation or attitude towards this. Part of the reason for that is that work is, for most people, a source of significant meaning and value in their lives, for better or worse. When you are out and about in society, when you attend parties, it's very common for people the first question that they ask you is, what do you do with your life? The assumption underlying that is that you shouldn't define yourself by your job, by what you do for a living. What I argue in the book, though, is that work, specifically in the sense of activities that are performed because they're economically rewarded, economically needed, is a bad thing for most people, most of the time, in ways that they don't always appreciate. More specifically, what I argue is that work is structurally bad. Okay, it's not that every job is bad. I'm sure some of you have jobs that you like, that you find quite motivating and self-actualizing. I say myself in the book that the job that I have is one that I derive a lot of meaning and value from, largely because I'm left free to do whatever I want. I said this in an interview to somebody recently when they were challenging me on whether I really, whether people should hate their jobs, because I say that I like my job. And I said, the reason why I like my job is because the conditions of employment for my job are imperfectly enforced. If the management in my university really monitored my activities and forced me to achieve all the metrics that they set up for me, it would be pretty unpleasant. And I think that's a phenomenon that many academics in this country lament, is the increased managerialism within the academic environment. I'm fortunate that so far I'm free from that. So what I mean by work being structurally bad is not that every job is bad and that you might feel bad about your job. It's not that work is necessarily bad in all possible worlds. It's more that it has settled into a pattern in our world right now that is bad. That there's an equilibrium within the labor market that is increasing the number of bad-making features of work. Bad-making is kind of a philosophical way of framing it. And so what I articulate in the chapter on the desirability of work, which is entitled Why You Should Hate Your Job, are 5 reasons why you shouldn't like work. Very briefly, and I'm happy to discuss these more afterwards. One is that work is a source of unfreedom. It kind of interferes with your freedom to choose the kind of life that you want to choose for yourself. It is also becoming increasingly precarious for many people. They don't work in stable lifetime forms of employment. They work in short-term gigs, like contracts that don't have the same kinds of benefits that we would like to have from our work. And this is actually a phenomenon that is made easier by technology, and look at the reasons why technology facilitates the increased precariousness of work. Work is also distributively unjust. The workforce is increasingly polarized. There are a few elite workers who can benefit a lot from the technological trends in work, both in terms of income, the amount of money they derive or wealth they derive from the work, but also in terms of the kinds of meaning that they derive from the work, that they get to perform the kinds of work that are meaningful. So I am, in a sense, a beneficiary of this polarization in the workforce. I'm pretty well paid, and the kind of work I do is meaningful. A lot of other people don't have that same outcome. In fact, the majority don't have the same outcome. So there's that distributive injustice in the workplace. I also argue because of the increased precariousness of work and the competitiveness in the workplace, work is something that is now colonizing more and more of our lives, or contaminating more and more of our lives. And it's very hard to find a space in your life that is free from the demands of work. You spend an increased amount of time both preparing for, performing, and recovering from work. And so students are increasingly encouraged to view their entire educations through the lens of employability, that this is the main focus and the main thing that they should care about. Okay. So even when you're not technically at work, the demands of the workplace feed into your everyday life. And the final point that I make in that chapter, the final argument, is that actually a lot of people aren't very satisfied by the work that they do. They don't derive a lot of happiness from the work that they do. And look at some surveys and reports that reveal this to be true. And I think that's partly due to the increased competitiveness and precariousness of work. That we're encouraged to view it through a lens of dissatisfaction, that things could be better. But so that's the first proposition I defend in the book. The second proposition that I defend in the book is that the automation of life more generally, outside of work, outside of paid employment, is a less positive thing. It actually poses a threat to human flourishing and meaning. And one of the ways I look at this in the book, I start with the example of Wall-E's Pixar movie, which I think shows one possible vision of a highly automated future. It's a satirical, hyperbolic vision of the future, but I think it's something, it does contain within it a kernel of truth. So I don't know how many people are familiar with this movie here. Some heads are nodding, but in Wall-E, the future is one in which we have lots of robots, automated technologies that can perform basic tasks, and humans live on these ships because they've despoiled the planet. We've had to migrate off planet to survive. We live on these ships where robots do pretty much everything, and we float around on these chairs, and we're fed a diet of fast food and light entertainment, and we just sit back and enjoy the ride while the machines do everything for us. And now, again, this is satirical, but I think it does contain a kernel of what the automated future could hold for us if it was dystopian in nature. And, to approach this from a more philosophical perspective, what I argue is that the way in which we derive meaning and well-being from our lives is dependent on two things. One is, do we do things of objective value, things that make a contribution to our societies, that make other people better off, morally improve the world? Do we contribute in terms of scientific understanding or knowledge? Do we contribute in terms of aesthetic expression and beauty? There's an old philosophical phrase for this, which is that the good life, the best life, is one that consists of three things: the good, the true, and the beautiful. So you make a contribution to the good, the true, and the beautiful. So we have to have that objective value, but we also have to be subjectively satisfied and engaged with what we do in our lives. And the big problem with automation and automated technologies is that it severs the connection between human activity and objective outputs. That you are no longer responsible for the things that happen in the world around you. You outsource that to a machine. So the achievements of the machine are no longer your achievements. I think there's a good illustration of this. People might disagree. I'm happy to engage with this as a debate afterwards, but there's a documentary about AlphaGo on Netflix, and a friend of mine, a philosopher in Oxford, Carissa Veliz, who's written this interesting blog post about it, where she argues that watching that documentary, she was struck by how kind of pessimistic or everyone was around the success of AlphaGo in beating a human player. It wasn't viewed as a real human achievement, like curing cancer or Einstein's theory of relativity. It was viewed as actually this is something to lament about the future of humanity, that we're no longer the top performers in this one domain in the middle. But I think that captures the problems of automation in life more generally and how it poses a threat to human flourishing, is because it severs that connection between our actions and what happens in the world. There's a more complicated version of this argument in the book where I outlined 5 specific reasons why this is problematic. And we'll explore those later on if you'd like. So then, shifting, the second part of the book looks at utopian futures, utopian possibilities. Is there a way to make this blank? Actually,
Press the bottom.
bottom of it.
No, the bottom button.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. I just want to make that blank for a moment. So at the end of the first half of the book, when I've outlined both the opportunity for automation, the way it can free us from the drudgery of work, and also the threats of automation, I can impose this crossroads that humanity now faces. I use a theory from evolutionary anthropology, about the cognitive niche. It's the argument that humans evolved to fill the cognitive niche, that what is distinctive about us is that we use our intelligence to solve problems, either individually or collectively. And what automating technologies, robotics and AI, threaten is our cognitive dominance. They're kind of pushing us out of the cognitive niche. So we have 2 possible responses to that. In very broad terms, we can try to double down on the cognitive niche, try to retain dominance of the cognitive niche, or we can try to recede from it and do something else. And I frame this in the book in terms of 2 possible utopias, what I call the cyborg utopia. It's one way of managing our relationship with technology in order to ensure continued human flourishing and meaning. But I argue in the book that this is maybe less practical, certainly in the short to medium term, and less utopian than many might suppose. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So I'm going to skip through these propositions a bit more quickly, and I'll go into them in more detail in a moment. So that's one possible utopian future. And the other way to manage the threat posed by automated technologies is to build what I call a virtual utopia. It's in a sense receding from the cognitive niche. And I argue that this is more practical and more utopian than many first suppose. So this notion of retreating into a virtual world, initially people recoil from it. At least that's my experience when I discuss it. This group might differ from that. But I try to argue that it is actually something that we would like to do. And this is the part of the book that I'm most interested in, and actually the majority of the book is built up with evaluating these different utopias. And so what I'd like to do is spend a bit more time discussing both of these in the remainder of this talk. Before I do that, however, I need to go through some kind of conceptual analysis. This is my philosophical leanings being brought to bear here on the topic, and discuss what a utopia is in the first place. And that's a concept that's thrown around a lot in literature and in everyday conversations. What does it really mean? And I'm conscious of the fact that in many people's eyes, utopianism is something that actually has a lot of negative connotations. This is something I experienced actually when I was talking about this book with people from America or US in particular, because I think in the US, utopianism is associated with socialism and communism, and these are failed utopias. And somebody who is utopian is viewed as being naive or Pollyannish and just not really properly engaged with the real world. And part of my aim with this book is really to rehabilitate the concept of utopianism and encourage people to adopt that label of being a utopian with some pride that they don't have to apologize for. But to do that, I do offer, I think, a qualified definition or understanding of what a utopia is. So what do I mean by utopia? Well, what I don't mean is this. Anybody know what this is? This is a colorized version of it's the frontispiece to Thomas More's book Utopia. It's the origin of the term utopianism. I guess what Thomas More articulates in that book is a very clear blueprint or model of what an ideal society would look like. It's a fairly unpleasant society in many ways if you read the book. It's this kind of neo-feudal society with some kinds of technologies that take away the drudgery of life, like childbirth and childbearing and things like that. But it's still, everyone has their place in society and there's certain things that they have to do. Quite similar to like Plato's Republic, where he maps out what the ideal city-state should look like. Is a blueprint for what that would be. Right, so what I mean by utopia is not this notion of having a blueprint for what the ideal society would look like. And there are several reasons why I don't think that's a good model of what a utopia would look like. One is that obviously people differ on what their blueprints are for the ideal society. There's disagreement about what it should look like. And also I think this is where the failure of maybe older utopian movements arises, is that there's oftentimes, let's say, a mismatch between the utopian blueprint and what people desire, what's possible for them, and this then justifies fairly unpleasant forms of social reform and violence in order to achieve the blueprint. The idea is that we're aiming for this ideal end state for society, this telos for society, and we just need to get rid of the people who are in our way to get there, or somehow brainwash them or reform them so that they desire this future. Right? So I don't mean a blueprint model of utopianism. What I actually mean is something closer to what Oscar Wilde articulated, although he doesn't really articulate it perfectly. It's a famous quote from an essay he wrote: "The soul of man under socialism, a map of the world that does not include utopia is not even worth glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing, and when it lands there it looks out seeing a better country and sets sail. And progress is the realization of utopias, of progressive utopias." So the idea here is that actually a utopia is something that we never arrive at. We never arrive at an ideal end state for society. It's always on the horizon, and we're always setting sail towards that horizon. There's always something better to do. And this, I think, better captures this notion, for me, of what a utopia or a utopian vision is. It's a horizontal model of utopianism. Utopia is something that has is a future in which there's actually many possible futures that are continually open to us, that we're not stuck in a single vision of what the ideal society should be. I mean, more formally, so what I argue a utopia is, I adopt a definition from a philosopher called Christopher York, that a utopia is any prospectively achievable scheme of radical social political improvement which would, if installed, leave every affected party better off and none worse while respecting the rights of all. There are certain problems with this definition in practice, but I like it in the sense that it doesn't give like a rigid blueprint for what a utopia is. It doesn't say a utopian society is something like a socialist, distributive, egalitarian society, although that could be utopian. What it says is that it's something that's better, it's radically better than what we currently have. And this suggests that there's actually many different possible utopias. I mean, the word radical here is just to indicate that it has to be a significant improvement over what we currently have. So I spoke to Christopher York about this when I was doing the research for the book. It's actually an interview that you can find online, and he made the point that a utopian society would not be, let's say, one in which everybody gets a free ice cream on Sundays. That might be better than what we currently have, but it wouldn't be radically better. Okay? Well, as some people wouldn't like the ice cream. And the other part of this is like a more philosophical bit of the definition of respecting the rights of all. I do criticize this in the book. It's probably not entirely possible to create a utopian society that leaves everybody better off.
I was thinking of billionaires.
Exactly. Okay, so somebody might be left worse off in a utopia, right? This is like an economic definition of efficiency, Pareto optimality. I don't know if people are familiar with that concept. That's basically what he's incorporating in here. So I don't think it's possible to leave everybody better off, but I think this bit is the more important part, that you're trying to respect the rights of all, that you don't just use people as instruments to achieving a better world, a better blueprint model of utopianism. Within the book, then, I also developed what I call a utopian scorecard, a way of measuring or assessing whether a potential future is actually utopian. I think I just remembered I have another slide in here. it doesn't quite go into that point. This was just the point about this horizontal model of utopianism that I have in the book. This is actually a diagram from the book itself, which is that we shouldn't conceive of a utopian future as, again, a single world, a single thing. It's rather a set of possible worlds, each of which is prospectively better than what we currently have. And we're sailing towards that horizon of different possible worlds. Okay. So, as I say, I develop a utopian scorecard in the book, a way of measuring and assessing different future utopias. And I've identified 4 conditions for something to count as a utopia. The first condition is that it has to try and minimize the threats posed by automation. So that second proposition that I have, that automation poses a threat to human flourishing and meaning, I think you need to try and minimize and stave off the threat that automation poses to human being. I say in the book that it's probably not possible to stave off absolutely every single threat, but you can try and do better than what we're currently doing. Right? So what that really means in practice is that we have to imagine a future that preserves a space for human endeavor, human agency, human achievement, that doesn't just leave the machines to do everything for us. That's that first condition. The second condition is implicit in some of the things I've said already, which is that the pathway to the utopia should be one that doesn't espouse violence, doesn't instrumentalize people, doesn't say that we can kill this many people because they're opposing our utopian ideal in order to achieve it. I discuss a lot here in relation to this the work of Karl Popper, some people might be familiar with. He was a critic of the 20th century utopian movements because of their inherent tendency towards violence. And he favored instead this notion that political idealism shouldn't focus on trying to achieve an ideal world, but rather trying to eliminate bad things in our current world, eliminating what he calls concrete evils from our current world. And he has an interesting argument for why we should do that. It's an argument from an epistemic humility or knowledge, which is that we know what concrete evils are, and so we know what we should be doing to eliminate them, roughly, but we don't know what the ideal world is. We don't have knowledge of that. So it's more practically achievable to focus on eliminating evils. One of the things that I argue in the book, however, is that actually eliminating evils from society would be a kind of utopianism. Right? That by removing more and more concrete evils from society, you might progressively asymptote towards a more utopian world. So, to cut a long story short, what I argue is that even though Karl Popper claims that being anti-violence and being a negative utilitarian is not a utopian way of looking at the world, I think it is actually a utopian way of looking at the world. The other thing I point out is that a utopian society should be one that maintains the right kind of balance between stability and dynamism. This is implicit in the notion of this horizontal model of utopianism. It's about setting sail towards horizons of possibility. But what I mean here in particular is that we don't want a society that's riven by strife and conflict, right? But we also don't want a society that is static and standing still. So we need to achieve stability in the right areas and dynamism in the right areas as well. So we want an open future where we can explore different possible forms of life, and we don't want a future which is full of lots of, to maybe a few revolutionaries, exciting conflicts. And the final argument I make is that any vision of a utopian future should avoid an excessive cultural gap. So what do I mean by that? What I mean really is that the vision of the future shouldn't be too alien to us. It should be something that is intelligible to us in the present day. Right, so if you came to me and said, a utopian form of life is one in which we all exist as beams of light traveling around the universe at speed of light, I guess that's implicit in the concept of being a beam of light, I can't rationally assess the value of that future. It's too alien, it's too different from the way of life that I currently have. Right, so the utopian vision should be one in which things are better, but they're still rationally intelligible to us in our present form. Okay? That doesn't mean that we might not eventually end up existing as beams of light traveling around the universe, because it might be that once we get to a certain stage of development, that becomes a rationally accessible idea. This is the progressive model of utopianism, which we're moving towards different horizons. But right here, in the year 2020, that's not a rationally accessible model of utopianism. So we should avoid this cultural gap. So these are the conditions on my utopian scorecard. And this is my way then of ranking and assessing different utopian futures. Let me then proceed to discuss the two utopian futures in the book. Starting with the cyborg utopia. And I come down against the notion of a cyborg utopia in the book, although I should say that it's a qualified dismissal of the cyborg utopia. I don't think it's completely undesirable, but I don't think it is something that we should prioritize right now. And why not? Well, for starters here, I need to probably say a little bit about what a cyborg is, or how I understand that concept. People in this audience might be quite familiar with this concept, but what I point out is that there's really two understandings of what a cyborg is in philosophy of technology and among some technologists themselves. There is what I would call the technical model of being a cyborg, where you're actually some kind of literal fusion between a biological or neurological system and a bit of technology. So, neuroprosthetics, brain-computer interfaces, these are all technologies that are putting us on the path towards this kind of technical cyborgization. There is another pathway to becoming a cyborg, which is popular among some philosophers and people in the humanities, which is this notion that we actually already are cyborgs in a sense. We're natural-born cyborgs, to use the phrase of the Scottish philosopher Andy Clark. So this notion is that we are a technological species from our origins. We have always had these kind of close relationships with technology, symbiotic, integrated, dependent relationships with technology. And we're just continuing to have more and more of those kinds of relationships over time. So the kind of relationship you have with your smartphone, say when you're navigating down the street using Google Maps or something, that's a kind of cyborg relationship, because there's this symbiotic interdependency between what you do and what happens with the machine. There's this kind of constant feedback loop between the two things. And so this means that the technology is still external to you. It's not fused into your biological systems or your neurological systems, but there is some relationship between them. And so one of the things there are these two different visions of what a cyborg is in the literature and the debate. And what I argue in the book is that they're really not fundamentally different. There's really just a spectrum between those two things. Okay? So an external technological artifact like a smartphone that you have an interdependent relationship with, that's one kind of cyborgization. But as the kind of interdependency between you and the technology increases, you start moving more and more towards this kind of technical model of cyborgization. So it's all just on a spectrum. They're not two fundamentally different things. That said, it's certainly much more feasible in the short term for us to become cyborgs in the sense of relying more and more on external technological artifacts than fusing our bodies and brains with technology. We have some interesting proofs of concept and developments in that space, but not anything sort of radical yet. It might change in the near future. All right, so that's the concept of a cyborg. Why is this kind of cyborg vision not desirable? Right, and part of the arguments that I outline in the book are linked back to this utopian scorecard that I have. So if you look at it in terms of that utopian scorecard, the advantages of the cyborg utopia is that it actually does conserve a lot of what we currently value about our way of life. If we can gain more kinds of power and ability, cognitive ability, physical ability through close relationships with technology, that might preserve our agency and prevent us from just outsourcing everything to a machine. Depends a little bit on the exact mode of cyborgization, but it's again a possibility. It keeps the horizons open for humanity in a couple of different ways. Right? One is that when you think about a horizon, you might think about that in a geographical sense initially, but I mean that in a much more abstract sense. Right? So there are different ways of human embodiment, human form, and cyborg technologies allow you to experiment with them. perhaps creating new kinds of sensory modality or sensory engagement with the world. There are people who do this already. Some of you might be familiar with them. Artists like Neil Harbison, who has this antenna that he has around his head that essentially allows him to hear colors. Just roughly what it allows him to do. So he's using a kind of cyborg technology to create a new form of sensory engagement with the world. And so he's expanding the horizon of what is possible for a human to be. And so you're keeping those kind of morphological or biological horizons open. There's also the possibility of keeping geographical horizons open. The very concept of a cyborg originated in debates about space travel, invented by a couple of scientists, Nathan Kleins and Manfred E. Kleins. They're not spelled the same way, they're not related, but they happen to have names that sound similar. And their point was that our biology is not well equipped for space, but we can change that if we become more cyborg-like, build up more kind of resilience to the stellar environment, and we can explore the horizons of space. And I argue that that would be a utopian project, because it allows for this kind of progressive and dynamic future. It's a little bit unfortunate that the main person who defends that view nowadays is, of course, Jeff Bezos. I've kind of seen his talk that he gave to his Blue Origin, is the name of his company, is that right? His Blue Origin group, where he essentially makes that case for space travel, that it keeps the horizons for humanity open. I gave a talk earlier in the year where I tried to defend Bezos from some critics about that idea. Not that I defend the work practices in Amazon or tax dodging or anything like that. Okay. The other advantage of a cyborg-like existence is it allows for greater existential robustness. And I mean that in the sense that this might be a route to achieving much longer lifespans, which I argue is a good thing and would be a utopian project. Also, this is a more philosophical idea, is that it allows for greater existential robustness for future generations who become more and more cyborg-like over time. So what I argue in the books is that the collective afterlife, the people who will exist after you die, are actually a source of meaning for you right now. If the entire Earth was going to, everyone was going to go extinct 30 days after you die, that would probably induce a lot of existential angst in your life right now, because you kind of want there to be this continuing chain of populations of beings in the future. So we want there to be this collective afterlife. This is like a non-religious conception of the afterlife. And one way of realizing a more robust collective afterlife is through cyborgization. So there are these good things about the cyborg utopia, but I think there are also some disadvantages to it. Okay? Now, one of the disadvantages is that in conserving what we currently value, it may also end up preserving work, the world of work, in its worst form. So the kinds of competitiveness and anxiety that people have around employment nowadays may actually just be exacerbated by pursuing cyborgization. Instead of competing on having a really good education, really good skills developed over time, you're competing on having the right kinds of cyborg implants. And so it just provides another avenue for competitiveness in the workplace. It's also quite possible, given how society currently functions, that the valuable forms of cyborgization won't be distributed fairly amongst the population. Some workers, some people will benefit greatly from it, and some people won't. So it's almost too good at conserving what we currently care about. I also think there are timeline issues here. Like, will we actually really be able to create the right kinds of cyborg technologies in a short enough time frame so that we don't lose out in this race that we're having with machines? In my mind, anyway, there seems to be some mismatch between those two timelines. It seems like the improvements in automatic technologies are coming faster than the improvements in cyborg technologies. There are also, practical risks to using cyborg technologies, just in terms of any attempt to fuse human biology with machine circuits. It opens up possibilities of infection, hacking the brain. There's a whole field now in brain-computer interfaces about neurosecurity, preventing these things from being hacked. So there are dangers inherent in cyborgization. There's also this is a more fanciful concern that actually being a cyborg might be radically different from how we currently live, in the sense that there's this large cultural gap between how we live now and what a cyborg existence might be like. I mean, maybe the clearest illustration of this would be something like the Borg from Star Trek, where they live as this collective mind. And so this does violence to individualism, the notion of being an individual who achieves things and is responsible for things in the world. It's a radically different model of the future, so that mightn't be something that we can assess and engage with. There's also another thing that, if it's the case that you can kind of replace any part of your body with a cyborg implant, that might end up with a very different kind of morality in the future. I think one good illustration of this comes from the science fiction author Richard Morgan, with this book called Altered States. Is it Altered States? And it was a Netflix series.
Altered Carbon.
Altered Carbon, sorry, Altered Carbon, yeah. So, the idea in that book and series is that in the future humanity invents this technology where we can upload our minds to these chips, these stacks that we just implant in the back of skulls. And so that means that once your physical body dies, you don't die, you just have to find another physical body to implant your stack into. And one of the interesting things that's explored in the book, but actually particularly in the TV series, and it's more visceral in the TV series because it's visual, I think, is the effects this has on the kinds of ethical rules around the treatment of the human body. Right? That there actually becomes there's something trivial about physically injuring or harming a body, and this is illustrated most dramatically in the book and in the show, where there are these kind of entertainment venues that people attend where they watch people beating each other to death. There's a married couple that does this for a living. They go around killing each other's physical bodies because they can always just take out the stack and upload it to something else. Right? So there becomes this kind of triviality to physical harm. Now, in that show, they're focusing really on, again, the impact on the physical body, but something similar could be true if we can replace parts of our mind. There might be a triviality to me, destroying the part of your brain that's responsible for long-term memory formation, because I can just give you another implant immediately that will correct for that. So it's a kind of radically different ethical world. So it mightn't be something that's accessible to us. In the book, I use the concept of a cyborg existence being unbearably light. And there's just something very frivolous and trivial about every aspect of it. So those are some disadvantages of it. I've probably been talking for too long, I think. Can I go?
Another 10 minutes or so?
Yeah, okay. So let me talk about then a virtual utopia. So this might be the trickiest part of the book and the one that's encountered the most resistance when I've discussed it with people. So I try to defend this notion of pursuing a virtual form of existence. But what do I mean by a virtual form of existence? So what I find is that I can't really, the concept of a virtual reality or a virtual life is not something that's entirely coherent. Okay, now that's the first point I would make. And we can illustrate this by thinking about the stereotypical view of virtual life, which is this notion that a virtual life is something that takes place in a computer simulated environment. We don some kind of headset, bodysuit, or we enter an environment that projects the virtual computer simulated world onto screens around us. We immerse ourselves in that world. This is kind of the notion most people have of what a virtual life would be. But would it actually be virtual? Well, you've got to realize that, it would be true to say that some of the things you encounter in a computer simulated environment aren't real, they are virtual. If you look at something like Second Life, let's say, that old virtual world, the kinds of people, the avatars that you encounter, the physical geography that you encounter, those aren't real, they're just representations of real things. But it is also true to say that some of the things that would happen to you in a virtual environment would be very real. You can have real conversations with people, you can build real friendships and alliances with people, you can feel real emotions, have real experiences, you can be really threatened or traumatized by things that happen to you. in this computer simulated environment. In fact, this is happening to us all already. We all live a lot of our lives in digital spaces through digital communication devices. But I don't think that many of us would say that the kinds of interactions that we have through these digital spaces are unreal. They are very real in many cases. So there's problems with that stereotypical view because lots of things that are allegedly virtual are in fact real. That's kind of part of the oxymoron in this notion of virtual reality. So there is an alternative view of what virtual reality is. A counterintuitive view, which is that actually most of our lives are already virtual in some sense. One of the more extreme illustrations of this is this quote. I didn't attribute it on the screen. Anyone know who wrote that? What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.
No.
Philip K. Dick.
It's Terence McKenna.
That's
Sorry.
the first one that came to mind because he talks about culture as an operating system. Is it from that?
Yeah. So when I was doing the book, I tried to research this, and what I found is that this quote is widely attributed to Terence McKenna, but I couldn't find the original source for it. Okay.
We'll speak afterwards. I may get it.
Doesn't John Searle's idea of the backgrounds, he doesn't use those words, but it's more or less the same sort of thing.
Yeah, so I have a long discussion in the book about John Searle's understanding of social reality being a kind of virtual reality. So there's this counterintuitive view that a lot of our lives are already virtual. And there's two ways in which they're already virtual. One is that actually we construct artificial environments in which to live that seal us off from a lot of the unpleasant features of the world. We're in one right now, okay? But there's also this sense that a lot of the interactions that we have with the world and with other people are a result of kind of imaginary projections onto our interactions with people. One of the classic illustrations of this, and this comes from Searle in particular, is money as being a kind of imaginary projection onto our relationships with other people. Money, we track that relationship through physical tokens, sometimes or digital tokens, but in a sense money itself is just something that we've collectively hallucinated. Okay? And the person who probably takes this view the furthest in recent times is this guy, Yuval Noah Harari. And so, he's written a couple of things about this, but I was particularly struck by an op-ed that he wrote for The Guardian a couple of years back, where he looks at these fears around automation and the future of work, and people saying, well, what are we going to do if we don't work anymore? We're just going to live inside virtual reality chambers and play computer games. And what he argues to counter that view is that actually, no, you're wrong. Most of our lives are already virtual, and we're all playing virtual reality games, as is. The most extreme illustration of this that he has in his article is this, that religion, he says, is a virtual reality game. Okay? It's about earning points through doing good deeds and then leveling up at the end to heaven or paradise or whatever. He also argues that consumer capitalism is a kind of virtual reality game. So his idea is that we have nothing to fear from the future because we're all doing this already. And now I think there's something right about what people like Harari say and McKenna and Searle, all these figures that I discuss in some detail. But I do think Harari probably pushes it a little bit too far. Okay? Because I think if you asked, so his view appeals to people like me, let's say, who've kind of stepped outside of a religious worldview. I say, yeah, well, when I look at it from my secular perspective, it looks like a virtual reality game. But if I asked somebody who was actually playing the game whether they thought it was a game, it was trivial in some sense, I'm pretty sure that they would resist that. They would say it is very, very serious indeed, and everything I believe in is real. So I think he pushes it a bit too far. So what I argue in the book, and this is the trickiest bit, is that if we kind of triangulate from this stereotypical view of virtual reality and this counterintuitive view, we can come up with a new understanding of what a virtual reality is, a virtual life is, where the life that we live is situated within an arbitrarily constructed environment, something that we construct for ourselves, so that there's no deep necessity to the rules of life. We acknowledge them as being arbitrary. Now, a good illustration of this is already with games that we play. A game like chess, there's no physical law that tells you how pieces should move around the board. Like, there's nothing that says they have to move in the particular way that conforms with the rules of chess. The rules of chess are an arbitrary constraint we place on how pieces should be moved, but we can derive a lot of meaning and satisfaction from that game. Okay? The idea is that actually, if we expand this view so that lots of things we do in life are bound by these arbitrary rules, and we can do this with the facilitation of technology, what we'll end up doing is we'll all end up playing games, and we'll all be fully aware of the fact that we're doing this, that we're operating within these arbitrarily constructed environments. And so what I say is that a virtual reality is something that is in some sense trivial or arbitrary, and that we know that it's trivial and arbitrary. And that's what differentiates my view from Harare's view. Because I think the point for a religious believer is that they don't think it's trivial and arbitrary. Looking back on it, trivial might be the wrong word to use, but we can debate that in a moment. The other thing about this understanding of virtual reality is that it is in fact technologically agnostic. Right? We could live a virtual life inside a computer simulation, but we could also live a virtual life in the physical world. Okay. The advantages of this. So, to cut through a lot of things I say is that the virtual life is one in which we just play games. Right? Initially, people will think that's a terrible idea. What I actually argue is that it's a very valuable thing. Going back to the Utopian scorecard I have, is that I think it preserves human agency. The games provide a space in which we can develop our agency. We can build our kind of moral virtues within the space of games. This is an idea that a lot of philosophers of sport have long had, is that sports are kind of morality plays, laboratories in which we develop our moral capacities. So we can do that within the games. We can have lots of open horizons because there's an infinite landscape of games for us to explore and develop. We can achieve things within the games, and the things that we do within the game can be kind of intrinsically good. And we can also approach this from sort of an ideal of craft. I look at an argument from a guy called Richard Sennett about how having the life of the craftsperson, or as he says, the craftsman, is a very meaningful form of existence because it's somebody who's skilled at a craft is very deeply engaged in what they're doing, and they experience kind of these powerful, positive psychological feelings with what they're doing, these flow states. And I think we can approach this kind of landscape of virtual games in that way too. I mean, there are disadvantages to this, which I discuss in the book. You know, some people will say, think that when I'm arguing for this, that I'm saying that we should spend all our lives playing games. It's not what I'm arguing. I'm just saying that the thing that we do other than working is playing games. Right? There's still all the other things that we value in our lives available to us, like family, friends, relationships, that kind of thing. Some people think it's unintelligible, but part of this is that within that argument that we're already living kind of virtual lives to some extent. You can say that we're already there, so it's not radically different from our present existence. I have a few more arguments within the book to wrap up this, but I think I'll leave it there and just open it up for discussion. So that's kind of my positive vision of this virtual utopia. Thanks for your attention.
Many thanks. So John, what kind of timescales do you have in mind for this? Is this something we should be urgently discussing here or now? Or is it something that there's no urgency about because after all we seem to be having more jobs created by automation, and so risks of technological unemployment seems to be receding into the future?
Yeah, so I think it's something that we should be considering in the here and now, and not something to be put on kind of a long-term vision. And part of that is that we shouldn't necessarily look purely at the number of jobs that are being created or the number of people at work. We should also look very closely at the quality of the forms of work that we're creating nowadays. And that's one reason why in that first part of the book I look at both the possibility and the desirability of workplace automation. Because it could be the case, and I think it is the case, that a lot of the jobs we're creating are ones that are unpleasant, precarious, anxiety-inducing. And so instead of doubling down on that and trying to preserve the world of work, we should think about radically transcending it.
Can I ask you a question there? Because one of the things which intrigues me here is the definition of work.
Sure.
And a lot of the emotion around automation and work is because there's a connection between economic activity and work. and economic well-being as well. And there seems to me to be something very fundamental in human nature, which says that you can automate as much work as you like, and people will still find a way of needing to trade things with each other, of needing to exchange things with each other, needing to be economically active with each other. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go out and knock out cars or manufacture things for other people. It means they're going to engage in a different way.
Yeah, so a few things there. I always kind of trot out this quote, maybe I shouldn't, but Bertrand Russell wrote this essay back in the early part of the 20th century called In Praise of Idleness, where he looks at the definition of work in that. And he says work is of two kinds. One is moving objects relative to a force, and the other one is directing people to do that. The first type is unpleasant and poorly paid, and the latter is pleasant and well paid. So there's a few things I like about that, but one of the things is that in that first kind of concept, which is, again, satirical or hyperbolic, he's pointing out is that you can have like a very expansive understanding of what work is, and work is just really any activity that we perform, any kind of physical or cognitive activity that we perform. Sometimes people think of work as something that's inherently difficult. There has to be some kind of triumph over an obstacle involved in work. In the book, what I argue is that work shouldn't be defined as a particular kind of activity. It should be defined as a condition under which activities are performed, namely a condition of some kind of economic reward or necessity. So when I talk about a post-work future, what I'm trying to do is remove that kind of conditionality from the activities that we perform. And what you're coming back with, which is interesting, is this notion that there will always be some kind of economic dimension to the activities that we perform, because we'll always want to trade or exchange things with other people. Is that?
That's pretty much it.
Right. Okay. So, so what I would say to that is that it will depend a bit here on what you think a trading and exchanging involves. Does that always have an economic dimension, like is there a monetary or commodifiable aspect to it? I think I would argue that I already kind of, if I have a hobby where I play sports with people, I'm kind of trading my skills with them, or I'm collaborating with them, but it's not an economic transaction. It's not something that's done for an economic reward or necessity. So I'm only interested in removing that kind of economic necessity or need from the kind of activities we
It's
perform.
a utility exchange rather than
It's
financial exchange.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a value to the exchange and interaction that the participants to the interaction get from it, but it's not something that is a kind of commodified value or a monetary value. So I'm perfectly happy with that kind of world and that world persisting. I'm less happy with the form.
Some really interesting ideas in there, but the fundamental point I'm struggling with is why is it one or the other? Why cyborg or virtual? Because I would have thought that the more cyborg you are, the more extensive the number of games you can play are. It gives you more opportunities to play more games.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't think they are necessarily opposed to each other. It's something I emphasize at the end of the chapter on the cyborg thing. Actually, I had a conversation just before this lecture with somebody. He's not here, actually. He said he was going to come. But about his point was that if you look at artists, again, like let's say Neil Harbison, the way they're experimenting with different forms of sensory engagement with the world, you could view that as a kind of like entertainment or game form. And so what they're doing is they're helping to expand the horizon of possible games that we could play. So I mean, I essentially agree with that. It's more a question of like, for me, yeah. So I get like, the way I think about it is that there's kind of two visions of what a cyborg is, in my mind. One is that there's a vision that is kind of like humanity on steroids vision, where you're just trying to improve all our capacities. And there's another vision where it's actually about moving into the adjacent possible for humanity, some new morphology or new way of engaging. I'm quite happy with that style. I'm worried about the other style because I think it'll just perpetuate the worst features of our kind of economic way of life at the moment.
But do you think you will, and your family members will, become more cyborg in the decades ahead?
I think we'll definitely become more cyborg in that kind of loose philosophical sense of having greater dependency and interdependency, hopefully, in relationships with technology. I'm not sure that we'll become like cyborgs in a strong, like, Kurzweilian sense, that we're just going to upload our minds to the cloud or expand our intelligence through nanoparticles.
But are you open to having stronger muscles, stronger skeletons, replacement organs, and so on?
Yeah, so I'm open to those ideas, but again, I think that one reason why for prioritizing the virtual utopia over the cyborg utopia is that I think that will only be pleasant for us if we remove the kind of economic features that could lead to this kind of competitiveness around cyborg influence. This is one of the things that is a mark of our employability.
Christopher?
Yeah, so I guess if you look at not just post-work, but a post-economic society with practically unlimited resources and space for people to express themselves in the ways that they choose, is there anything that would drive us towards a shared global humanistic future where we all make the same choice in these scales? Or do you see there being the branch of humanity going down the cyber route or genetic manipulation or space exploration, or maybe going backwards? For example, we'll choose to live in a medieval physical game, if you like, where they decide to have those rules.
Yeah, I didn't get into that in the talk, but another aspect of the case for utopian future is I look at an argument by a philosopher called Robert Nozick on the meta-utopia. So effectively what he argues is that you can't build a single world that is ideal for everybody. Instead you have to create a world-building mechanism that allows people to create worlds that they enjoy, that meets their compatibility. So that means that you do have to have some kind of global or overarching institutional structure that allows people to create these worlds and kind of polices the boundaries between them and prevents, let's say a group of neo-primitivists from converting everybody to their cause through terror or missionary activities, I'd say, because that wouldn't fit with that vision. But what was I going to say? It does allow for this kind of plurality of possible futures. So that's another one of the conditions I have within the discussion of the utopian scorecard that I decided to eliminate from this, which is that you have to have some acceptance of pluralism.
How far will that pluralism go? Could there be people who are strongly opposed to your vision and say this is a bad thing, that we shouldn't be having these modifications, we should be embracing work, we should be resisting this retreat into the virtual, and they go on an evangelical crusade to stop this happening?
Yeah, so what I argue that there are some kind of moral constraints on acceptable utopian visions. Okay, but one of the ways in which you could tolerate the people who like working and like the work ethic is that you create a virtual reality game for them in which they spend all their time working, and that's one potential future.
Do they know they're in a virtual reality?
So that's interesting as well. So are they aware that they're in this virtual reality game? Are they like victims of the matrix or something? Yeah, like that's something I discuss in the book. So I kind of hedge a little bit on that, in the sense that I think that the preference is that they know what's happening to them at all times. That this knowledge condition that I have on knowing what kind of life you're living is always met. In certain extreme cases, it might be acceptable to do away with that, if it's the case that they are somehow radical zealots that want to make everybody work.
Okay.
So if I just follow up quickly on the point about having one planet and only one planet, essentially. Right now, that is the case.
Sure.
It's impractical to have yourselves completely isolated, if nothing else, because of limited space. But following on the comments about Bezos as well, if we actually had unlimited space, then we could use the space in that sense around us, and it would be very easy to build a colony, let's say, that is physically separate from the.
Yeah.
Would that change how you see it?
Yeah, so what I argue in the book is that one of the weaknesses with Nozick's understanding of a meta-utopia is he was a libertarian and argued for the minimal state, and said, but the problem for him is that you do come to these geographical limits to how many different kind of associations or communities you can build, right, and how you can maintain peace between them. So you have to create other spaces for them. One possibility is through colonization of other planets or asteroids or whatever. But one possibility, the other possibility that I talk about in the book is actually you do use the power of computer simulated environments to create other spaces for people to move into. I have a longish discussion in the book about what is space colonization a good thing, and I look at two competing arguments as why it could be a bad thing. So why it could be a good thing. One is the argument you outlined that allows for this kind of peaceful pluralism. But some people argue that might be the case. So there's a guy, Phil Torres, who's written an interesting paper about the possibility of a catastrophic intergalactic war. And so what he argues is that if you set up all these different colonies on different planets or different parts of space, there's a likelihood that they'll develop different value systems. They might even develop into different species because they face different kinds of selective pressures in those environments. And this could breed a kind of radical suspicion between all these different colonies, and then you face a challenge of how the colonies might want to engage in preemptive war against one another because they're afraid of one colony wiping out another. How can you prevent that from happening? Well, the way we do it on Earth is that we have states or global orders that prevent this to some extent, more or less successfully. But how can you do that in space? He uses the language from the philosopher Thomas Hobbes. The way in which you keep space is by creating a leviathan that keeps the peace. But it's not possible to create an intergalactic leviathan that will keep the peace. And there's also people there's a guy called Charles Cockle, he's an astrobiologist. He's written a couple of interesting books about, I can't remember the title of them. It was basically about tyranny in space, where it looks at the problem for a lot of off-world colonies is that they'll face very harsh conditions of existence. And the likelihood then is that this will provide an incentive for increasingly authoritarian forms of government to prevent people from sabotaging the space colonies, because these colonies are so fragile they can't really tolerate dissent or disagreement within them. Otherwise, everyone would be extinct.
Let's take some more comments from the floor. Lucy?
So I had to come back to my question because that was such a good point about resilience and kind of also the power of science fiction to make us think through things. So people like Alistair Reynolds and Neil Stephenson talk about this a lot, using science fiction as a way to work these things through in theory so that we don't actually have to do them in practice. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that there's some threads that I picked up in what you've been saying about some really big shifts that I've been using in my work and really considering, and I thought it might be useful to make them a bit more explicit and to hear your responses on them. One is the balance between centralised and distributed. We're seeing that in all sorts of different dynamics. Another, which I think you have really focused on, is this idea of questioning the values of things, of why we're doing it. What's the purpose? Is it about status? Is it about security? Is it about whether we can feed ourselves next week? Or is it about more abstract things? And then the third one is about that balance between abstraction and the real. Because I think it's interesting that you've mentioned Terence McKenna, because we've got a huge rise at the same time as we've got a huge rise in technology, we've also got a huge rise in the interest in shamanism, biohacking, functional medicine, ways of modifying our bodies and our cognition and the way that we see the world that don't involve technology. And so I'd like to reflect that back to you. Thank you.
Okay, so centralization, distribution,
You don't have to answer all of it.
biohacking, shamanism, psychedelics, the middle one?
A return to values and questioning values.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the middle one's again the easiest one, in that I think that's sort of like
You've almost answered that already.
that's the kind of the entire ethos behind what I do. In fact, our esteemed host here today, David, I was listening to his book, Sustainable Superabundance, this week, and he makes that point quite well. He talks about how science can tell you how to do things, but it doesn't tell you the kind of values that should guide what we're doing. And he makes the case for transhumanism as the value system that should guide what we're doing. And so that's very much what I care about. And again, the frustration that led to me writing this book was the sense that a lot of people who write about technological unemployment and automation don't necessarily like clearly articulate the values that they're using to guide their analysis and subject them to a lot of critical scrutiny. So that was the goal of what I was doing. In terms of, you know, non-technological forms of manipulation with the human form, so I tend to see those as kind of part of the same project of cyborgization. So I discuss this in the book, that there's these 4 different pathways to cyborgization. One of them is through those forms of enhancement or change. Partly because I think they just, what they do is that they encourage us to see the human as something that can be tinkered with and manipulated and changed, that there are other modes of engaging and relating to the world. So maybe it's a stretch because it doesn't involve this kind of like fusion between man and machine or technology and the human form, but I think it is part of a similar ethos of experimentation with human form.
Let's move on. Sorry. Peter?
Okay.
Yeah, a bit touching on that as well, and kind of touching on this kind of concept of abstraction and difference between real and virtual. So I guess you're familiar with simulation hypothesis as well. And there's this interesting thought that perhaps, this kind of simulation, this reality, is something that we have created in the future. You know, I wonder if you have encountered that thought.
So you remember the simulation hypothesis from Nick Bostrom?
But a bit of variation on that. So it's kind of like we're moving into a place where we'll be able to create a simulation in a way.
Yeah, I suppose honestly I would say that I haven't engaged with that a lot. I guess Robin Hanson with Age of M is probably the person who's considered like what an existence in a simulated form or an emulated computerized form would look like, and I think he conducts a very detailed, almost dare I say it, painstakingly detailed analysis of what life as a simulated being would be like.
The simulation argument is a great one for the pub, I think.
Well, the simulation argument is slightly different from that because it's more that there's a 33% chance that we're already living in a simulation, or a 1/3 chance.
Right, yes.
Thanks. I'm particularly interested in the state transition between where we are, where we're going to go to, whether it's a particular utopia for the Western world, for the sub-Saharan African world, and what are the stages we'll need to go through? Do you see any transition? Have you done any work on the transitions between now and then?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and again, honestly, the goal of my book was to evaluate the possible future. It is particularly around automation, not every single possible future, and I don't map out a pathway, particularly for getting from here to there. That wasn't my aim. I've been criticized by several people for not discussing climate change in more detail in my book, or not discussing things like the kinds of political movements we'll need to form to achieve these alliances, and those are all valid criticisms. What I would say is that it's impossible for any one book to address every single issue, and so I was just trying to focus on, is this a good place to even try to get to? Once we have some kind of vision of what might be an inspiring or desirable future, then we can work back from that to more kind of practical pathways towards realizing it. I mean, I have some general thoughts on it, which is that, again, this is not something that's going to happen just inevitably or naturally. It's something that I think we need to fight for, and there is a need for collective human action and political action around getting us towards that future.
So it starts by having a public discussion,
Organizations
raising people's
like this,
ideas, thrashing out issues, and then gradually people will say, well, in that case, we will need this to happen. Paul?
That question was answered, thank you.
Question?
Can I just make one more point about
Yes.
on that question? It's just that again, part of the motivation here is that I wasn't convinced that I'm not claiming that I'm necessarily good at doing this, but I hope I'm slightly better than some of the things I've read about it is I wasn't convinced that a lot of the people writing about future work were painting a very inspiring picture, and so I wanted to try and do that.
So we need better pictures of the future than altered carbon and so on. We need to have more people imagining the positive and the exciting and flourishing and meaningful future in which we are participating in these games, if you would call them.
Yeah, look, this is obviously there's a bigger issue about the value of science fiction in understanding the future. And I think it is very valuable. There's well-rehearsed debates about why most science fiction is dystopian. It's powerful for narrative reasons and everything. Utopian fiction tends to be pretty dry. Books like things that Neil Stevenson have written, Walter Carbon, I think they're all useful in helping us to map out this future. But what they never really engage in at great length is the kind of like rigorous assessment or analysis that I think we should engage in.
There's about half a dozen hands, so let's try and take some. Yeah, at the back.
Yeah, this is kind of related in a way to that last point. I was interested in what you said about unbearable lightness being a potential disadvantage of like a cyborg-dominated future. But it seems to me that's, well, there's a few things. But like, firstly, it seems that's not necessarily something that's only a disadvantage of a cyborg-dominated future. It's also potentially a disadvantage of one in which we can, if we can envision a future where we can create virtual worlds that can influence human emotions and tendencies in such a strong way, then there's a definite possibility of trivializing a lot of elements of what we consider to make up human personalities at the moment. And secondly, I think that there's an argument that that's not necessarily a disadvantage. I think the argument you gave of like even ruling out like direct like software editing of the human mind and instead influencing tendencies through virtual reality. There's still it's hard to envision like a reason to do like what you suggested, like to delete part that forms long-term memories. But there's definitely a lot of other things we could envision, such as like a kind of more mature like focused like hard science and psychiatry, where we delete certain what we consider to be undesirable tendencies in human beings through certain virtual reality scenarios. So I think it's arguable that that's not necessarily a disadvantage, but regardless if it is or not, it seems like it could be a strong factor in either possible future that you discussed. So I'd just be very interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, let me just see a second. Sorry. These are other things that I had in my slides. So like one of the main objections to the kind of virtual utopia is what I call this Westworld objection, that virtual realities will become these kind of playgrounds for
This is a TV series that some people may have seen and not seen. Yes, Westworld.
Sorry, I should have said that. It's a novel by Michael Crichton initially. Originally.
I'm in a film and a TV series, and it's been round and round.
Yeah, it was a film like in the early '70s, and then it's still a TV series, I think, and HBO is still going. So really what this is about is creating essentially a virtual playground populated by artificial beings that you can rape and kill and torture as you please. Like that's essentially it. It's this kind of entertainment venue. And so this is one of the concerns that people have about virtual utopia, that it becomes a playground for these kinds of immorality. And what I argue in the book is that that's a little bit similar to the concern about this unbearable lightness of being a cyborg. Because, again, the concern there is that it kind of trivializes things that we currently think are wrong. And is that a problem? Well, like, here's a thought, right? In philosophy, in moral philosophy, we distinguish sometimes between two different kinds of thinking about what is right and wrong, what we can do. You have consequentialist theories that look at the consequences of our actions. And what are called deontological theories, which have to do with like essentially that there are certain kinds of actions that are just intrinsically wrong, irrespective of their consequences, right? So one of the suggestions I make in the book, and this is more speculative, and it's at the very end of it, where I just didn't have time to really flesh it out in more detail, which is that these kinds of futures may lead to a world in which consequentialist forms of ethics no longer make much sense, because the consequences of our actions can be easily reversed or repaired through technology. All right? And so what does that mean then for
morality? Does that mean we switch to a more kind of deontological view that there are certain things that are just intrinsically wrong? Or does it mean there's kind of no morality at all? I tend to favor the notion that the perfect world, of the perfect automated world where we can do anything we want through technology at the flick of a switch, and correct any damage that we've done to the world, is, I think, a world in which we'll become much more focused on the notion that there's some things that are intrinsically wrong, irrespective of their consequences. But some people might disagree with that. They might think that actually technological perfection does away with all moral rules.
Tony?
I would like to refer to the automation of work, whether it's possible or desirable. But perhaps the question should be rephrased. What should be the pace of work automation? What is the desirable pace of work automation? And I'll take one example. Is the cultured meat production.
Sorry?
Cultured meat production from stem cells. On one hand, it would be ideal to have it right now. But in America, where you can already buy burgers made from stem cells for $60 in a restaurant, there is a limit of a kind, like a license by FDA, how much of the meat you can produce so far. And one can see that this process could be extended. You can actually manage the automation of, in this case, production of agricultural goods in such a way that it doesn't disturb the society too much and that everybody has a little bit of work. But there is a big if. If we proceed like that, we may think about the great libertarian ideas, the greatest goodness for the greatest number of people. But which people? If we are thinking about the Western world, that would be us. But how about Africa? Something you mentioned with Africa. If we take it in global context, we take the global warming, because if you had, for instance, agriculture made of stem cells, you would reduce the energy and water consumption by 100 times, right? We should progress very fast. Now, to finalize my point is that there is no one answer to that very difficult ethical question. But I think in the end, it will be a pretty chaotic approach to that. So what the society should do? The society should prepare for the worst. That it would be chaos, and therefore the government should anticipate that and launch certain initiatives like the universal basic income, so that people are gradually prepared to that they work once or twice a week. So that's not an abrupt process. In 2035, 2040, it will be a non-existent question, because almost everybody will not have to work. You may have to pay for work if it comes to the 50s and so on. So I wonder what's your view on that?
Well, I certainly think it's the case that some kinds of social policy, governmental policy, can affect the pace of change in areas, depending on how they incentivize or discourage different activities. So the regulatory rule that you talk about related to the FDA and stem cell meat obviously has an impact on the relative pace of change. There is a question about how effective it is to actually try and control the pace of change here, because societies don't operate in isolation. There's a global competitive economy, and if one tries to slow down the pace of change in areas, someone else will see an opportunity and speed up the pace of change. So, yeah. I think you're basically right that we should try and prepare for the worst possibility and work back from that, and that might mean that we're pursuing the most maybe dramatic changes at the moment. I think that there are problems with that then in practice, and that are people prepared for these adjustments? Is this going to sow the seeds of lots of social discontentment? There's a lot of disruption already happening in the workplace, and governments haven't really been well equipped to deal with these disruptive changes, and are often reacting. Again, I mentioned my background is in law, and this is just like a perennial problem and question in the law around technology, is that most laws around technology are reactive. The problem has already transpired by the time you try to create some regulatory interference to control it, and then by the time you create that regulatory interference to control it, it's moved on to a new problem. It's a new innovation and new disruption. So, like, given those difficulties we have in practice in creating an institutional framework that can slow down and manage the pace of change incrementally and gradually so that everyone's happy with it, I think you could be correct that the best way is to prepare for the most chaotic possibility.
Where do you think the changes might be happening first? Will they be happening in Europe, or might they be China, or some other countries who say, you know what, this is going to happen, let's hurry up and make it happen?
Well, this is an interesting question. It's an argument I've had in relation to something else, which is that I think it's if we focus on the kinds of AI that we have at the moment, they're ones that rely heavily on data, and that's how you can leverage the power of AI by collecting and using data in innovative ways. And what has happened now in Europe is that we've created fairly robust protections around data, uses of data. I think there's good reasons for doing that, and I think there are lots of good arguments as to why we should have done that. But this may then mean that a country like China, which seems less concerned with individual privacy and rights around data, is actually better positioned to take advantage of the kinds of technology that we currently have in place. So it's an environment in which you can do more things with AI. Or maybe through data protection, we've slowed down the pace of change here.
But maybe the things that China wants to do with it are things that we would rather not have done in the first place.
Absolutely.
Ollie?
I think one of the problems becomes a barrier to us benefiting from automation and post-work is capitalist organisation of production.
Mm-hmm.
So it does automate, and it does undermine itself in a way through automation. But as I think you mentioned, it just provides more work because it has to rely on wage labour. So many people now, they end up in worse jobs or lower paid jobs, or they're in unemployment. So they either have to work harder to benefit from the rewards it creates, or they're unemployed. And it mentioned by someone else, this is a chaotic situation. But I think generally they just use it to create more work. So I think there needs to be, collective sort of social movement or ideas in order to change the relations so that it can be used to benefit people. And secondly, another problem is many people still have very traditional ideas that there is a kind of natural state of being that we all have always lived under, which is not true, of course, because things change all the time, but they have this idea that there's a natural state of things and that you should never interfere with this, that all tech, the fruit and knowledge or whatever is somehow dangerous, and if we interfere and change our way of life through automation, that somehow it's going against the natural order of things. I think that's a barrier as well, kind of cultural barrier, if you like. So there's an economic and cultural barrier that needs to be overcome.
I think the first point is correct. So capitalism does have forces within it that encourage automation, but it also has countervailing forces that also encourage kind of doubling down on work. So it's not something that's inevitably going to happen. We're not going to inevitably transition to the post-work economy just because of forces that are intrinsic to capitalism. So it does require some kind of collective change, particularly to how if we're going to be relying on money and income to gain access to the things we care about, it's going to require some significant redistributive change. That's one point. The second point about there being a natural order that we shouldn't interfere with, it's kind of a bioconservative view, I guess. There are certainly people who think that. One argument that I've made over the years, make it a bit in this book, but I've made it in other papers, is that I think there's actually a conservative case for lots of kinds of intervention in the human condition. Because when you think about conservatism, what are we trying to conserve? We're just trying to conserve what currently exists for its own sake? Or are we trying to conserve the things that we find valuable about our current way of life?
Right? So there's this kind of naive, simplistic form of conservatism that's just about preserving the status quo, whatever it happens to be. And there's what I would call an evaluative form of conservatism, which tries to conserve what we value about the current way of life. And when you focus on evaluative conservatism, it may often be the case that you need to intervene in humanity in order to conserve the things that we value. We can discuss this in more detail if you like, or you can read the paper I wrote about it, but it's kind of the Red Queen problem where you have to run in one place to stand still. Or to run faster to stay in the same place. It's from Alice in Wonderland or Through the Looking Glass or something like that. So if there's lots of disruptive changes happening elsewhere in society and the economy, it may be that to conserve what is valuable about the current way of human life is to change humanity to match those disruptive changes.
You had a question?
Yeah, one frame of reference that I find really meaningful is the Kardashev scale, if you may be familiar with that, which basically says that there are keystone stages of civilization development. The next one for us would be that Kardashev level 1, which would be a cohesive planetary civilization which consumed the entire power output of the planet. Which would seem to make sense because of the achievements that the world would be now being able to harness energy efficiently, to stave off climate change, restore the habitat, and to make post-scarcity society, eliminating the need for us to fight each other for scarce resources. So the question is, how structured and how prescriptive ought we to be in all of this towards that specific goal as something to guide the whole of humanity towards, and over what, and to what point in the future should we be aiming at from today?
You should read David's book, Sustainable Superabundance, which is about that entire question, I think.
You also referred to Jeff Bezos' vision of going into space.
Yeah.
When people went to the moon in the 1960s, you, for a while, united all of society. And although it was an American group that planted an American flag on the moon, and people from all countries somehow felt part of something bigger. One of the greatest things that humanity did is send Voyager 2 out to the edges of the solar system, so that whatever does happen on Earth here in the future, even if the sun expands and destroys the Earth, a little bit of humanity will be going forever into the outer space. So I think having a bigger vision, which is being painted here to an extent as well, the vision of a life of meaningful, flourishing games and creativity, is going to help people raise away from the kind of the backward-looking visions which are pulling people. People say, "Oh, let's take back control and go back to how life was in some imaginary previous time." But if we can have a better vision of the future, which is what London Futurists is about.
I mean, to take your question more seriously, rather than passing you off to David and reading his book, what you should do, though, is that I suppose I might say like 3 things about this need to create sustainable, long-term energy capture, harnessing energy. One is that, like, I think we should aim for it as a goal. That should be something that we do. But we should also probably plan for the contingency that we fail in doing it. All right. There's a good paper that was written last year. I'm not going to remember the title of it properly. I think it's like The Long-Term Future of Human Civilization. The main author is a guy called Seth Baum on the paper, where it paints these kind of possible long-term futures for human civilization, not in terms of post-worker values, but just long-term survival for humanity. And he talks about the need to create maybe certain kind of colonies or pockets of humanity that can recreate civilization in case for some reason it fails, it collapses. So I think we should probably be doing that as well.
In terms of Mars colonization.
Yeah, that'll be one way of doing it. Maybe there are other ways of doing it too. Or creating and storing the kinds of knowledge we need to reboot civilization if something catastrophic happens.
Like Harry Seldon.
Yeah. So it is a very Asimovian project in that sense. And the third point I would make, and this is more controversial, I guess, but I read this book last year by Charles Mann called The Wizard and the Prophet, and came across this. It's kind of about competing visions of the environmental future. One kind of espoused by people like Norman Borlaug, which is all about technological innovation to make sure we meet the needs of future civilizations. And the other vision is now the prophet vision. I can't remember the person who espoused that, but it's the notion that we're reaching the carrying capacity of the Earth, and we're not going to survive.
That's more Malthusian.
a more kind of Malthusian view that we need to slow down what we're doing in order to make sure we don't breach these kind of carrying capacity
Which is where
limits.
longer lifespans is kind of counterproductive.
Right. So actually, that's one of the things that Mann discusses in the book. But like, there's a point he makes in it that I find interesting, and it is true when you kind of research it in specific domains. Is that we really don't like. We do make estimates on what the carrying capacity of the Earth is, but we really don't know actually what it is and how close we are to breaching the limit. So anytime we predicted that we're at a limit for something, it's turned out to be false retrospectively.
There's things like the Haber-Porter process, aren't there? That
Yeah.
put more reactive nitrogen into circulation and so on.
At this stage, let me mention Andrew McAfee's new book. It's called More with Less. Andrew McAfee is an economist at MIT. He's written a number of books together with his colleague Eric Brinchelson on things like the second machine age. This book, More with Less, does look at the history of Malthusian predictions, people such as the Club of Rome and others who predicted, Paul Ehrlich, who predicted doom and gloom. He says these arguments were serious, but what's actually happened in recent times is that we are having less of an environmental footprint on the planet. There is a new sense of enlightenment. We're actually getting lighter with our footprint. We are, for many purposes, in at least some countries, beyond peak stuff.
I'm sure Australia would be really happy to hear that.
No. He is very clear. It's very clear that there are still very big issues here. There's a couple of chapters basically saying there are strong, outstanding problems with the particular problem of global warming, and there are other ecological issues too. But he does make a fascinating survey of this. It's definitely on my reading list. A new book that you mentioned by Charles Mann on The Wizard and the Prophet. That's on my reading list for a while. I haven't sure whether to promote it higher or not.
Well, look, I mean, so this is turning into a book recommendation club, but
book recommendations.
Andrew, yeah, my book first, but then so Andrew McAfee, I think like that's good, but he's kind of arguing for a kind of optimistic view for the large part with these caveats and qualifications. One thing I like about Mann's book is it's just a little bit more kind of dispassionate in reviewing the history of the debates on this issue.
You had a question?
Well, it was going back to what you were saying about getting people to imagine like a more positive future, so they're more receptive to the idea of accepting automation.
I can repeat it.
Yeah, and that's unusual. I'm not usually accused of being too quiet.
Sorry.
Well, I think one of the big problems with people resisting a workless future is people in their everyday lives, not in what they see in science fiction. Like, there's plenty of science fiction, and some of it is dystopian, some of it's very positive. You've got Star Trek as a more positive example, right? And Star Wars and things like that. I mean, they're very fantastical, but you know, I don't think people really, the average person, connects that deeply with sci-fi in the sense that they could think of what they see in sci-fi as really being something they can actualize in their own lives. But sorry, there's like a fibre in my mouth from my scarf. It seems to me like people, because of the current system where everyone is so busy and consumed with the messages they receive from advertising and the media about what their immediate focus should be on, they haven't really had that space in their lives to cultivate much introspection and connection with themselves and what their personal goals are. So to a lot of people, the idea of losing work is losing identity, like you said, because they haven't formed a real true identity for themselves, because the way the system currently works doesn't allow them to. And I think one of the key things that people need to be encouraged to think about if they are to accept a workless future is to realize that there are alternative ways of living without structuring your entire existence around, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And actually, I think when you think of what work means, somebody said this earlier, work is like what you do. My idea of what work means is what you would do only because you're being paid to do it, or only because if you don't do it, there are bad outcomes, punishment or that type of thing, because you could say to study. Yes, yeah, but if people weren't, exactly, but if you were more intrinsically motivated because you'd had the space to be able to focus on such things, you would work in the sense that you'd be productive and creative in a workless future, but it would be in line with your personal goals. But I'm just wondering how you get that message to people, like in the here and now, because I think it's very difficult with the mechanisms in place with neoliberalism, consumerism, capitalism, and advertising, and media making everyone very terrified of things and just jumping on bandwagons and, you know, all these, you know, I really feel like it's advertising and the media that are like a big, and obviously which are representing the interests of, you know, the elite, and obviously I feel like that's a huge barrier to getting people on board with a workless future, and that's probably part of why people aren't really that receptive to the idea of automation.
Yeah, I think I think you're right in the sense that people don't connect to this within their day-to-day lives because most of them don't have the time to think about these alternative futures because they're busy making ends meet and surviving within this increasingly precarious economy, and they're also not presented with these alternative visions. So I think, you know, the goal, partly again in writing the book, is to provide that alternative vision and to, you know, I try to articulate why it's the case that work shouldn't be seen as something that is overly valorized or is the be-all and end-all of life. So, again, partly it's because the extrinsic motivations that are provided by the market direct your effort and your skills and your abilities in a way that is not conducive necessarily to your happiness and flourishing. Like, some people are lucky enough to have found jobs that do perfectly match what they want to achieve in life. The vast majority of people don't find that. There's always some mismatch between the two things. So one part of it is just to try and shock people out of their current complacency around the kind of life that they're living and see the ways in which it is bad, and then to try to articulate this alternative possibility, and then again to work back from that to the collective action and change in society, having conversations like this and having organizations that can be working towards this more positive future. I mean, you notice I'm using the word work there as well. They're going to be doing things actively because they want to do them, not because it's economically necessary. I'm reluctant to use the terminology, but like what I'm arguing for here is classic, you know, Marxism, where you're trying to raise the consciousness of the working, the people who are trapped in this current way of life.
You had a question?
Yeah, I think it piggybacks a little bit on what you were saying. My question was maybe you have any suggestions on how we can possibly prevent possible versions of utopias that would force us to live and work in environments that have arbitrary constraints from happening, like some kind of early warning system. For example, we are not fully aware of the impact of current developments, or not all of us at least, in happening. For example, in outer space travel, online shopping, Eurosecurity. And as a result, it feels that we are being driven into some certain utopia unknowingly and only find out perhaps too late if it's good or bad for us, and just trying to get some more control.
Yeah, look, I think kind of maybe repeating myself in a sense, but I think that what you need to avoid those problems is people who are engaging in kind of more long-term thinking. There are a number of organizations around the world who are doing this. Obviously, organizations like London Futurists, but also more academic research organizations. Things like the Future of Humanity Institute or Caesar in Cambridge. They're focusing more on long-term risks and having kind of warning systems in place for that. But it's really just about facilitating a public sphere in which conversations like this don't get crowded out, and that there is putting this on the radar of powers that be. And I don't know of any way of doing that apart from, you know, writing books, articles, building organizations, having public debates.
But let me know afterwards, this is a question to everybody, what are the trends that you think we're not paying enough attention to? What are the things that we might end up in a future that we say, oh, we shouldn't have come here, we should have discussed it earlier, too bad we got distracted. So let me know afterwards what, because you have various dystopias in mind, I can see. Let me know what these might be, and we can have more London Futurists meetings trying to raise awareness of exactly these risks. You had a question?
So I just wanted to bring to the attention of the crowd related to the concept of living in a virtual reality world. This has been already attempted on YouTube by a gamer and a YouTuber which lived a 24-hour marathon in a virtual world named Minecraft. he wore a headset for 24 hours straight, and he only attended his basic physical needs. So it's up there. I just invite you to give it a look.
What's the name of the game?
The video game is called Minecraft, and if you look for VR Minecraft 24 hour, you will definitely find it. And this is something which makes it feel that is real, we're there. And the other point is more related on the first part of the book, related to the automation part. It's very similar and has very many points in contact with something which has been theorized by another person, which is Jacques Fresco in his resource-based economy. I don't know if anybody ever heard about it, but one of the main pillars of having a society which is sustainable from automated point of view is overcoming the concept of currency. So having a society which is entirely based on the monitoring of resources, automated production, and not having a currency, because with a currency you have an inherent concept of scarcity and inequality. So have you heard about this?
Yeah, so Jacques Fresco is the Venus Project, is that right?
Yeah.
So I just have to confess that I'm not as familiar with his work as I would like to be. People have mentioned it to me a few times, but I haven't really engaged with it in a huge amount of depth. The notion of a kind of a post-currency society, I have some skepticism about the possibility of that. We could probably eliminate currencies in the current form that we have them, but I wonder, partly kind of your point that we'll always be doing things that where we trade and exchange with other people. We might revert to other kinds of ways of keeping track of transactions. And there's an interesting book. It's a very academic book by, I can't remember his first name. His surname is Erdi. It's called Ranking. It's all about the different kind of rankings and ratings we perform in society. And the main argument is that we're always ranking and rating each other, and these are kinds of currency.
Social capital.
Yeah, so obviously there have been dystopian depictions of this, and so Black Mirror is probably the most famous recent illustration of this, where you have social credits based on doing good deeds for others or getting rated on social media apps. And then again, China is another country that is engaged in this kind of thing. So there are other ways in which we could attach some kind of ranking or rating to what we do, which ends up functioning very much like a kind of currency.
Is the argument also that although abundance will make many things abundance, there probably will always be some things that are still scarce by their nature?
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. That there are certain things that are always going to be scarce. So let's say in an information-rich economy, human attention becomes a scarce resource that people compete over, and being first in anything was going to be a kind of scarcity. Being the first in time, or being rated or ranked as the top performer in certain things. So there'll probably always be these forms of scarcity that we can compete for. If you want, there's a very good podcast, although it's partly defunct now, called, well, it's not defunct, they still release occasional episodes, called Review the Future. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. I did appear in a couple of episodes, but they did a really good episode about what will remain scarce in the future. It's 5 years old probably.
Is Stephen Kolb?
No, it's two American guys. One of them's like a game designer, and the other is a screenwriter, John Perry and Ted Copper.
Okay.
I'd recommend checking out that episode about what's scarce.
So we're almost out of time. I'll let you talk in a minute or two about your book.
Okay. I have 2 books to give away.
2 books to give away?
Yeah.
How are you going to give them away?
That's a good question.
It's scarce, aren't they?
Yeah, they're very.
So, I have to rank and rate the audience. We chatted beforehand. So there's one member of the audience who's already getting a book because we communicated in advance. So
maybe put 2 ticks on the attendance list, randomly.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea.
It's a bit heavy.
Okay. We're now using an automated process.
called wiggling a hand around.
Subject to, there is a problem in that some of the names here are just first names. So,
We'll have to rely on people.
so I'll just kind of randomly pick a point.
And there's another page over.
Emily Yao? There you go, you get a book. And I'll use the second page as well. Samantha Cansfield? Thanks. I was told by the publisher, if you want to purchase it, that copies are available in Waterstones and Garrow Street. Admittedly, I checked earlier on and they only had one copy. So I was told that they had 20 copies, but
the ebook's very accessible, I have to say.
yeah, it is an academic text. It's expensive. I think the Kindle edition is like £18 on Amazon, and then
I find it very interesting to read, and it's a whole bunch of interesting ideas that we haven't had time to dig into here.
yeah, sure. Yeah, there's a lot more detail in the book than it could possibly raise in the time that we've had.
In a minute, I'll ask you to thank John. There's a chance to continue the discussion informally at a nearby pub. Some of us who know the way will be leading off there quite soon, and you'll be able to follow up the discussions of the simulation argument. Are we really living in something that was created by our descendants millions of years in the future, or even 20 years in the future, perhaps? We're going to look at some of the other arguments we haven't quite been able to look at, like the Venus project, and could we have a resource-based economy in which there's no money, or any other angle of the future of being cyborg or virtual or just enhanced. London Futurists are continuing in many different ways. There are other events in London, of course, that do look at the future. There is a new group called Fever Up. Is William here? William said he might come from Fever Up. I mentioned them because they're hosting me a week on Monday. I'm giving a talk there about artificial intelligence for beginners, and that rules all of you out because none of you are beginners. But I'm giving a talk there about what is artificial intelligence really, and how can you make up your mind about artificial intelligence, given that there are so many people who've got so many vested interests in saying things about artificial intelligence. Those who want to boost it, those who want to pour scorn on it, those who want to hype it, and different angles. So you can look that up online, Fever Up. Otherwise, keep your eyes on the London Futurists social media, where you'll find out more that we're doing. And the last thing that I'd like to do today, ask you to join me in thanking John Danaher very much for sharing such a lot of fascinating ideas. Thanks all.
Thanks very much, everybody.